Ladies and gents, please put your hands together and please welcome to the stage.
Hello again. Scorched earth policies and the destruction of homes, herding civilians into captivity behind barbed wire fences might have been a novelty at the end of the 19th century, but it was to be anything but out of the ordinary by the time that the 20th century ended. Indeed, the concentration camp, as used by Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Communist China and Britain, bids fair to be something of a leitmotif for the entire century. From the time of General Weyler onwards, civilians were frequently regarded as legitimate targets during times of war, rather than, as was previously the case, being seen as largely an irrelevance. Non-combatants were now viewed as pawns to be used and abused as circumstances dictated. This then is the origin of the concentration camp. It's got nothing at all to do with the British and everything to do with the German general. It's probably fair to say that few people living in London today are aware that concentration camps even existed in the capital at one time. In Liverpool on May the 10th, 1915, angry crowds attacked shops belonging to people with German names.
The very funny Sunny Leone!
Wow!
Some of the owners of these shops had been living in Britain for 50 years and had sons serving in the British Army, but it made no difference to the furious mobs. Houses were looted and what could not be carried away was thrown into the street and set on fire. Similar scenes took place across the country, from London to Salford. The reaction of the authorities was revealing. As the Manchester Guardian reported on 11th of May, apropos of the rioting in Liverpool, a great many Austrians and Germans in the city who have hitherto been allowed their liberty are now, it is stated, to be interned in order that they may be preserved from mob violence. A few days later, columns of civilians were being marched out of the city under military escort. Their destination? A concentration camp. 2 days after the rioting, the Chief Constable of Manchester ordered the arrest of every German shopkeeper in the city. Similar actions were taken elsewhere. The pretext for the rounding up of harmless butchers and tobacconists was that these men were being taken into protective custody to save them from harm. It was widely known, though, that the arrests were really reprisals for the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, the event which had triggered the rioting in the first place.
Yeah, I'm here. I never in my life thought I would be doing this, by the way. So, my name is Sunny Leone, and you all know me for something I've done in my past.
I thought I'd talk this evening about a very old wives' tale which has been circulating for the Lord knows how many years. Certainly the Nazis used it as a propaganda method, and that's the idea that it was the British who first used concentration camps, or who invented them.
That you all have judged me for, and that I might be a little ashamed of. Musties are they?
The expression concentration camp really only acquired negative connotations during and after the Second World War. Before that time, concentration camps were known simply as places where civilian prisoners could be held indefinitely without trial, not for what they had done, but for who they were. For example, because they were communists, Jews, Germans, Ukrainians or Republicans. Valeriano Valeri Nicolau, born in 1838, was the son of a Prussian, which was part of what we now call Germany. His father was a career soldier who had moved to Spain, and Valeriano decided to follow in his footsteps, becoming a lieutenant in the Spanish army by the age of 20, although still retaining the same nationality as his father, which is to say Prussian. He was a German soldier. His was a glittering military career. He fought in the 10 Years' War, which took place between 1868 and 1878, and was later appointed Captain General of the Canary Islands. It was an earlier incident in his life, though, when as a young man he had been sent to Washington as a military attaché at the Spanish embassy, that gave Valeriano Vela the idea for which he was to attain fame, or perhaps more accurately, notoriety. During the American Civil War, while he was attached to the embassy in Washington, young Vela heard about the tactics employed by General William Sherman as he swept through the southern states, using what would become known later as a scorched earth policy. Not only was Sherman an exponent of brutal warfare, burning entire towns to terrify the enemy into submission, he also waged a campaign which some thought amounted to genocide against the Indians. Using his slogan, "The only good Indian is a dead one," Sherman harried the Indians mercilessly, seeing that they were penned up in camps where they died from starvation and illness.
India was long doubted for its global standing, a country that saw 200 years of British rule, a messy partition, and then surrounded by regional foes. But even amid all this turmoil, it has a vision to emerge as a global leader in the 21st century. Today, India has not only made its space among the leading world powers, it has achieved what very few have been able to, and that is global cooperation. New Delhi does not believe in pulling other nations down. It knows how to coexist with differences, and the groupings that India is a part of are proof of this.
Masti Zade. So, I just want to get this out of the way because I know what you all are thinking. Sex, 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 sex. Chotu.
It is a strategic security alliance. While it is relatively new, the alliance has proved to be a major player in peace and stability. China's growing hostility in the region has been one of the top agendas. From India-Pacific, let's now move to Asia-Pacific. That brings us to SAARC. This grouping is an economic and political organization of 8 South Asian countries. The region is standing at a crossroad. There's a severe economic crisis in Sri Lanka, Taliban has returned to Afghanistan, and Pakistan is facing a dual crisis, that of economic and political. India has been extending its neighborhood first policy here. It has helped Sri Lanka financially and Afghanistan socially. Indian Prime Minister was one of the first to congratulate Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif when he was sworn in.
British newspapers in 1914 and 1915 did not hesitate to talk of the concentration camps which were being set up throughout the country. Sherman's activities, both against the Confederacy and the Indians, made a great and lasting impression upon the young soldier who went on to govern several Spanish colonies. At the age of 58, General, as he was by then Vela, was sent to Cuba to suppress by any means he chose the rebellion which was threatening to drive the Spanish from the island nation. When he arrived in Cuba as a newly appointed governor of the colony, Vela found that the rebels were practically at the gates of Havana, the capital. He realised that only an altogether new and radical policy would be able to save the country for Spain. The expression concentration camp might only date from the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, but the concept itself is an ancient one. In 1997, an archaeologist working at Hadrian's Wall even suggested that evidence had been found of the world's earliest concentration camp, which had been set up in Britain.
Coming to Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is a transcontinental political, economic, security and military alliance. India, along with China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Pakistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are member states. In the recent years, New Delhi has pushed for action against terrorism in SCO meetings, which has been seen as a major concern in the region.
The purpose of these camps was more often than not to concentrate in one place foreigners who might not be fully supportive of the British war effort. These men were almost exclusively German and Austrian, although there were also a leavening of Turks and Bulgarians and Irishmen. Many had lived in Britain for years, sometimes for many decades. There was no suggestion that they really posed any threat to British interests. It was enough that they had been born in an enemy country. The Defence of the Realm regulations provided the legal framework for imprisoning civilians from enemy countries, but it's likely that the government was not, at least at first, especially keen to implement such measures. Some Germans living in this country were young men of military age who might conceivably have wished to return to their own country at the outbreak of war to enlist in the German army and fight against the British. Most had lived in Britain for years. Often they were married to English women and in some cases had become naturalised British citizens.
Let's now look at BRICS. It is an alliance of 5 major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. It was formed in 2009 to strengthen economic cooperation. After all, these countries make up nearly 1/4 of global GDP. But as years went by, the objective of this grouping has broadened. There are a myriad of security concerns with China. This grouping has helped New Delhi and Beijing become a commercial partner. And lastly, the talk of the town, the G7. India is not a member of this group, but New Delhi has been invited 8 times to their summits. The Group of 7 is a bloc of some of the most richest countries in the world. And this year's invitation comes despite India's differing view on the Ukraine-Russia war. India is part of multiple groupings with very different countries. Each group has its own purpose and agenda.
Because I know what you all are thinking. Sex, 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 sex. Chotu.
Some political, others economic. But what remains constant is India's aim to find common interests and a vision to coexist. But at the same time, New Delhi does not shy away from sticking to its stand. It doesn't believe in bowing down at the helm of its core principles.
This fan really sticks out in my mind. She comes up to me with her baby and she goes, "Photo lo, ye aapki fan hai."
And for more on this, we are now being joined.
At the outbreak of war in 1914, an old factory stood derelict in East London. William Ritchie and Sons had run a jute factory in Carpenter's Road in Stratford, not far from where the Olympic Stadium now stands. There was a fairly substantial community of Germans in East London at this time. They tended to be shopkeepers, and there were so many of them in Stratford that it was sometimes known as Little Germany. The Germans had integrated well into the area, and it was not until the war began that any sort of friction had been known in Stratford between the English and Germans. There were, however, other shopkeepers in East London whose antecedents were not so conspicuously British, and on the 15th of December 1914 a large number of these men were arrested by the police and marched to the disused jute factory in Carpenter's Road. The Stratford concentration camp, for such was its official title, had a bad reputation amongst those interned during the First World War. Surrounded with barbed wire and with mounted machine guns pointing down at the prisoners, it was a grim place to spend the 3 years it was in existence. Writing of it in his autobiography, The London Years, Rudolf Rocker wrote that the Stratford camp and its commandant had a dreadful reputation. News had spread of terrible things happening there. It was not always the fault of the British military administration. The German internal administration was as much to blame, particularly for a great deal of corruption which existed there. The head of the internal administration was a man named Weber, who seemed by all accounts to be a sadist and did his best to make life in the camp impossible. Those who are familiar with accounts of the concentration camps of the Third Reich will find descriptions such as the one above eerily familiar. The capos, prisoners in positions of trust and authority in Nazi camps, were often said to be even more cruel and sadistic than their German masters. So it was at the British concentration camps during the First World War. The commandants would choose prisoners and place them in authority over the others. This power often went to the men's heads. There was certainly casual brutality at the Stratford camp. 140 prisoners there signed a complaint against the commandant. One man to whom he was speaking refused to address the commandant as Sir, for which impudence he was struck in the face by the commandant. It is strange that the memory of these concentration camps established not in remote rural areas but in the very heart of the British capital should have faded so completely. You would be hard-pressed to find a local resident in that part of London who has even the vaguest idea that a concentration camp was once operating only a few streets from where they live. An even more extraordinary example of such convenient amnesia concerns a concentration camp which was set up at a major London landmark. Alexandra Palace is an entertainment venue in North London. Opened in 1873 as a centre for entertainment and education, it lies between the suburbs of Muswell Hill and Wood Green. Alexandra Palace is famous as being the site of the world's first high-definition television broadcasts, which the BBC began in 1936. Ali Pali, as it is affectionately known to the locals, was perfect for broadcasting, being situated on a tall hill with a commanding view across the whole of London.
Are there any differences or achievements being made from these summits? Leaders meet and the world doesn't feel or even see the results. Several summits have been held amid the war in Ukraine. The war is still ongoing, still nothing. Or are we being too harsh on the leaders?
No, I think as a common man, you have every right to be critical of diplomats like this. Okay, so if you want the other view, I will tell you. There is a Ukrainization of the global agenda. A war not of our making, but we are carrying the can for it. So we have to face recession, we have to face high energy prices, we have to have challenges to food security. Yet India is becoming a part of the solution for all. The second part is that Europe had not recovered from post-pandemic economic problems. And now with additional sanctions on Russia, it is going to suffer even more. It needs good partners in the economic sense, and India fits the bill. People are now worried not only of Russia but also of China. And when you think of China plus one strategies, you think of India. So India fits in with the Indo-Pacific plans of the Europeans, and therefore I think on all things that matter, most important to them, resilient democracies and sustainability. And India is fully green and ready to go on both these issues. So I think while things may not change and they may look difficult, it is the steadfast course that India is following that makes it a valuable partner. We are not the big talkers and doing little as much of the G7 seems to be, but we are talking little, doing more, and I think that is what matters.
फोटो लो, ये आपकी फैन है. I mean, fan from where? Does she not know who I am? I mean, all I want to do is tell this cute little baby is watch Captain America, not Naughty America.
Ask anybody living in and around the area about the history of Alexandra Palace, and you'll be sure to pick up snippets of history of this sort. You might be told of the two huge fires which almost destroyed the place, once in 1875 and again in 1980. One thing you will not be told, because it has been entirely lost to memory, is that a century ago, Alexandra Palace was the site of one of the largest concentration camps which this country has ever known, holding over 3,000 prisoners. At the outbreak of war in 1914, Alexandra Palace was commandeered by the military and used as the headquarters for King Edward's horse. The horses were kept at times in the tennis courts. In March 1915, a concentration camp was established at Alexandra Palace for so-called enemy aliens. These were Austrians and Germans who had been living in the United Kingdom when the war began. Many of them had been living in the country for years. Some had arrived as babes in arms and knew no other country. Nevertheless, because they were technically German or Austrian, even if they couldn't speak a single word of German, they were regarded as enemies. The British were accused by the Germans of mistreating the prisoners at Alexandria Palace, although there was very little evidence of this, either in the accounts of the prisoners themselves later or those who visited the camps to check on the conditions there. It was certainly no holiday camp. The place was horribly overcrowded. The 3,000 men slept on plank beds in the Great Hall, and the windows and doors remained closed for 4 days at times, and the stench was absolutely abominable.
So this one guy comes up to me and he goes, Sonny, what's 68 plus 1? So the headline reads, Sonny Leone talking about 69 will blow your mind. Or this other guy, he's like, Sonny, fairy tales kaise khatam hote hain? Sonny Leone wants happy ending.
The foundations of many round huts were found near a Roman fort, and the idea was mooted that this had been some sort of camp under the control of the Roman army and holding British hostages. More recently, camps such as Andersonville in Georgia, a prisoner of war camp during the American Civil War, have produced conditions as shocking as any seen in the 20th century. Of the 45,000 Union prisoners sent to Andersonville, no fewer than 13,000 died of starvation and disease. The commandant of the camp was hanged after the war. Most of the previous camps that were established before the Cuban War, places like Andersonville, were specifically for prisoners who had been fighting against an army or working to overthrow a regime. What was novel about the camps set up by General Vela was that they were from the very beginning intended to house civilian non-combatants, primarily women and children who had no part in any fighting. The main problem faced by the Spanish army in Cuba was that the guerrillas fighting them were all but indistinguishable from the ordinary Cuban peasants who were working the land. These men could ambush a Spanish column and then slip back into their homes later and resume their normal life, which meant that the enemy had no need to worry about supplies and so on. They just went home at the end of the action to wives who had a hot meal ready and waiting for them. It was clear that unusual action would be needed and unconventional tactics would have to be devised to combat this new type of belligerent.
I know, so creative, right? Bollywood and adult films are very different. In adult films, you know who's going to screw you. And sexuality in Bollywood is, very different.
The idea that General Vela came up with was to clear the countryside of its inhabitants and force the entire population into special areas. These areas would then be fortified and defended against any rebels. Anybody found in the countryside would be automatically viewed as an insurgent and liable to be shot down without warning. The fertile fields themselves would be untended and the peasants confined to the new camps left to provide for themselves as best they were able. On 21st of October 1896, General Vela announced all the inhabitants of the country now outside the line of fortifications shall within the period of 8 days concentrate themselves in the towns so occupied by the troops. The homes that the peasants left behind were frequently destroyed and their farms ravaged so they could not provide food for the rebels. The temporary camps set up within the towns were only ever intended to be a stopgap measure. No real provision was made for those within them. As the months passed, conditions grew increasingly desperate. To get some idea of the conditions of these reconcentrados, as the Spanish called those whom they had concentrated in this way, we cannot do better than examine the evidence of an eyewitness.
Bollywood is obsessed with water. I mean, they think you just throw some water on an actress and it's sexy. I mean, Bollywood and my Subsy guy.
The staff from the American Embassy made several visits to the concentration camp at Alexandria Palace to keep an eye on how things were developing there. Food was something of a sort of anger among some of the men being held there. These same buckets which were used for mopping the floor were used at mealtime for serving up soup, a fact which made some of the prisoners unable to stomach the meal. In the later years of the war, horse meat was substituted for beef, and the daily calorie intake for each man was estimated to have fallen to 1,489. The average man needs 2,500 calories a day simply to maintain his weight and health. These figures suggest that the prisoners at Alexandria Palace were, at least by 1918, on a starvation diet. The men who were detained at Alexandria Palace might have faced a meagre and unappetising diet, but at some concentration camps they were being killed by rifle fire. The Isle of Man was thought to be the ideal location for keeping large numbers of prisoners because, of course, anybody escaping would still find himself trapped on the island. Thousands of prisoners of war and civilian internees were held in camps on the island. On the 19th of November 1914 there was a serious incident at the Douglas alien concentration camp, as a result of which 6 men died. There had been a number of complaints from the civilians who had been transferred to the concentration camp at Douglas from the mainland. The accommodation was intense, and as the winter approached, the prisoners felt that these were wholly inadequate for their needs. The food left something to be desired as well. Dissatisfaction about the food grew stronger as November passed, and on 19th of November the prisoners decided to stage a protest in the dining hall. After they'd finished their midday meal, the men began to smash crockery and overturn tables, jeering and booing at the kitchen staff. Guards were called, and when they entered the dining hall intending to disperse the protesting prisoners, they were met with a hail of food, pieces of broken crockery and so on.
So I could care less about the haters.
It is not peace, nor is it war. It is desolation and distress, misery and starvation. Every town and village is surrounded by a trench, a sort of rifle pit, but constructed on a plan new to me. These trenches have at each corner, at frequent intervals along the sides, what they are there called forts, but are really small blockhouses, many of them like a large sentry box, loopholed for musketry. The purpose of these trenches is to keep reconcentrados in, as well as to keep the insurgents out. From all the surrounding country, the people have been driven into these areas and held there to subsist as best they can. They are virtually prison yards, not unlike one in general appearance, except that the walls are not so high and strong, but they suffice, where every point is in range of a soldier's rifle, to keep the poor reconcentrado women and children. With no crops to harvest in the towns, no livestock, the situation for the hundreds of thousands of smallholders and peasants who were thus confined in that way was dire indeed. If the guards had simply withdrawn and waited for the men to cool down, matters would likely have passed without violence. In the event, they loaded their rifles and began firing into the dining hall. That the guards at the Douglas concentration camp were intent upon carrying out a massacre seems beyond all reasonable doubt. Counting the remaining ammunition after the firing had ended and the dead and wounded removed from the scene, revealed that a total of 34 shots had been fired into the packed dining hall. 5 men were killed immediately by the volleys of fire that day, and another died later of his wounds. Many suffered bullet wounds, and given the circumstances, it's a miracle that more hadn't died. The inquest, which was held the following month, found that the dead men were victims of justifiable homicide, the protest in the dining hall having by that time been described in British newspapers as a riot. This wasn't the only instance of a prisoner in a concentration camp being shot dead by guards. A few days before the shooting on the Isle of Man, there had been another incident a little closer to London. One of the earliest concentration camps set up had been at Camberley in Surrey. There were 8,000 inmates there in the middle of November 1914 when there was a disturbance one night. What Weyler called his reconstruction plan may well have been a military success, but it soon became a humanitarian disaster. Well over 250,000 people died of hunger or disease as a direct consequence of Weyler's actions in setting up his camps for reconcentrados. One figure for the total number of dead is 321,934. At about midnight, one of the guards at Camberley heard the sound of running feet and then some scuffling. When a light was turned on, the source of the sound, it became apparent that a group of prisoners were making towards one of the gates. After shouting a warning, the guards opened fire, killing one man and wounding another.
Zero regrets. And that, my friends, is my happy ending.